Great. Am I audible? Um, I use he, him pronouns, and I'm Vedesh. I will be the PM. If everyone's ready, start now. Three broad things in the speech. First, what does this narrative look like? Why has there been a recent shift in how people think about relationships that's harmful? And just finally, simply, why is prioritizing this a good thing? I think first, it's important to characterize that people right now think that when there is a time or energy trade-off, they ought prioritize friendships in certain instances. We, however, think that if you have this narrative shift, people are willing to sacrifice those friendships and pursue the relationship instead. It means, like, for example, you are willing to move cities for the sake of your relationship when otherwise maybe you'd be more skeptical of doing that in the first place. It also just means the standard that you hold your relationships to are higher in the sense that the other independent things that you're willing to give up in exchange for that are probably more important than a friendship, just given that you spend more time with this person. The other thing to note is that this manifests in a sociocultural context, which means it influences how you see relationships in the first place, how you actually understand relationships to be, all of which means that people internalize this in the context of the community and circumstances that they're growing up in. At that point, why is there a recent shift that is probably harmful, and why do we need a correction for this? I think recently what we've seen globally is a de-emphasis on romance, which is to say that in places like the West, there's been a new idea that, for example, you don't need a woman or you don't need a man. We've instilled this idea that people can be wholly independent, and if there's any minute harm in the relationship, they ought leave because they must reclaim themselves a sense of independence, and they'll always have friendships to fall back on. The key thing to note is that this probably has been overdone in the sense that a lot of people now have a very, very high standard for relationships, and they're much lower lonely than they used to be in the past, in the sense that they're willing to give up romance for any small infraction, even when this might not be in their best interest. We also see a similar phenomenon in the East as well, where, for example, people are in arranged marriages where they have very little autonomy in the first place. It means that they're less willing to understand what they want coming out of this relationship because they've been entrenched in this system in which they're told that they ought just have that and accept the arranged marriage that they're given rather than pursue a relationship they particularly care about. The point here is that
POI.
upend these structures outright, but rather you can, within the confines of an arranged marriage, for example, actually have a more nuanced relationship. You can realize that this is something important to you, and from the outset, you can also advocate for example, getting a partner that you like and someone that's more in line with your values, just in the sense that you recognize that this is something that you emphasize more than rather than the counterfactual. I'll take a POI now for closing.
Yeah, so this is like completely
Closing.
asserted.
So is this narrative a recent narrative, or does it predate the trends of loneliness that you talk about?
So, this narrative about prioritizing romantic relationships, I think probably existed in the past. What we're supporting is the idea that we ought reclaim this narrative and we probably should maintain this narrative insofar as there's been a recent trend towards the opposite, which has been harmful. I also just don't think that this is assertive. The two examples I'm giving are real phenomenons. That's why I'm outright explaining them. The point then is that the only way that people can get this sort of fulfillment is probably if they realize that romance is something that requires much more emphasis and much more support. This is also proven by the fact that there are things like loneliness epidemics in the West right now. Why then is prioritizing this a good thing? I think A, it probably means in the most extreme instances, even though the narrative has a marginal impact on either side, we're still able to get people to upend the systems. It means that, for example, within an arranged marriage, for example, they're willing to talk more to their partner. They care much more about fostering this good relationship, and it means that they don't fizzle out in the long term. But I think that also it's just the fact that relationships are very important. So in the vast majority of cases we're accessing, where people are in relationships that they have a lot of control over, they're willing to recognize that this is something that requires unique care and unique time, just insofar as you probably spend the most time with this person. You probably are speaking to them the most often, and you're going to spend vast majorities of your life with them years into the future, which is why the impact is that much more impactful. Why then is this done well, and why don't we get complacency like you think an opposition team might try to say? I think the point that's quite simple is that you're not going to be complacent, but rather you probably hold the relationship to higher standards because of what you're sacrificing. You, for example, are giving up friendships. You're, for example, recognizing that this is something that requires unique care, which is why you want to get more out of it. The point then is that all of the changes that have occurred over time that make people more willing to advocate for themselves in relationships don't dissipate. It means that you're willing to actually communicate with your partner in the first place. You fall back on your friendships that you do have and speak to them about the relationship, but you also just have this notion of self-respect that you shouldn't be carried around or moved in a way that you don't necessarily like, and you're able to maneuver yourself within the relationship in a very good way. The point then is simply that you're giving more to the relationship, so your partner is probably more satisfied and there's just less conflict overall. Why do we think that prioritizing relationships is so important? Number one, again, it's just a large impact. You are spending your most of your life with this person, and the vast majority of instances, especially worldwide, you're compelled to start a family with this person. The point then is that these other narratives around relationships don't dissipate, so we ought probably prioritize relationships, just given that there's so much emphasis in other regards on them, which is why if you put that care, you'll get much more out of it. This is also just something that's very fulfilling to the vast majority of people in the sense that you only have one long-term relationship in most instances. This is something that's been emphasized so much, and it's something that's also biologically entrenched, which is why we don't necessarily want to sacrifice on it. I'll take another POI from opening, if there's none. The second major reason that this is important is just the availability, which is to say that with friendships, you often are able to have multiple friendships at a time. You probably have a lot of people that you're meeting over the course of your lifetime. Whereas, given that relationships are exclusive and given that they're oftentimes year-long commitments, it means that if you don't have a relationship locked down, or if you aren't able to have a successful relationship, it's much harder to start and succeed in the long term. The point then is that people right now are in a loneliness epidemic in the West, for example, where they aren't able to have successful relationships and where they're often very old by the time that they actually want to settle down and have a family, just given that they have these high standards and weren't able to put that time into actually prioritizing a relationship in the first place. The delta that we're getting then is that people are much more intentional with their relationships. They recognize that this is something that's going to influence the rest of their life, and they're more willing to satisfy their partner and they're more willing to satisfy themselves by putting more into the relationship. It means that people are able to access this impact that has those long-term implications rather than put it off into the future, and then it probably means that people are more fulfilled in the rest of their life. Friendships probably don't last forever in the sense that other people are entering romantic relationships. They're already sacrificing their time. They're already getting involved in this. The point then is that we don't want other people to be left behind. Other people who seek a relationship and recognize that it's important to them probably should be compelled to put in the work necessary for this actually to succeed. You need to correct for the change that's happened rapidly, that's led to a lot of people being dissatisfied in the relationships. I think that only happens on OG. For those reasons, very, very proud to propose.
Thanking PM calling hello.
Audible and everything, I guess, right?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, great. Panel, I want you to look deep within your souls and fact check a bit of government case. Is there actually a crisis in loneliness? Is there actually people that are opting out of romantic relationships because of the trade-off with their friends, not because they don't want to join relationships? Opening government case simply uncomparative and doesn't rely on the narrative. They never say why this narrative particularly, trading off your friendships to romance, is the reason why you fix this and not why this makes it worse. The case for opening opposition is very simple. One, that this simply makes you feel more isolated within your relationship. And B, that if you have more variety of friends and romances, you maximize your own preferences, therefore being able to live a more fulfilled life. But before that, some simple, very obvious things. People will want to spend time with their partner under both of the house. This is because one, they chose their partner, therefore they probably like them a lot and they want to spend time with them. Secondly, because of the romantic need and biological imperative or whatever, that they want to be with their partner in order to stay in some kind of romance. But three, because there's just one person in comparison to your entirety of your friend group. So you're way more likely to spend time with them. This means that overall, in the status quo, without this narrative in the first place, you're likely to spend time with your partner. But B, this narrative probably manifests in decisions where you have to make a decision between your partner and your friends, a trade-off. Therefore, inside government, you're more likely to opt in for your partner than your friends. Very clean so far. What does this mean then for opening opposition? It makes you feel more isolated in relationships because you grow a larger dependence on them. Why does this narrative isolate you within relationships? I think two main reasons. The first is that since you pick and choose between your partner and your friends, you're way more likely to spend time with your partner, but B, that this time that you spend is directly in contradiction with your friends, i.e. that you're telling to them that I need to spend time with a partner and you're directly pushing them away. This means you're way more likely to be reliant on your partner in that regard. But B, I think there is a higher expectation from your friends that you will spend time with your partner, so they're less likely to call you to go out. They're less likely to engage with you in the regards that they're not expecting you to be there. All of this means that you're way more likely to spend more time with your partner, less time with your friends. However, this grows even worse the moment that open government says that you choose the city that you stay in based on your partner, that you change your life based on them, since that means that you directly alter how many relationships you have, how many friendships you know. So it makes it even harder for you to know new friends, to learn new friends. Therefore, it is way more likely that you're isolated within your partner. Why then does it create immense harm within your relationship? I think three things. One, you grow a larger dependence on your partner. Now, this is not inherently a bad thing, right? However, it grows particularly bad when you have only your partner or you spend more time with your partner. This is because, one, you rely on them for your own emotional vulnerabilities and needs. This means that you put a larger burden on your partner to carry with you. The moment that you're anxious, you're not going to call your friends to go for beers or something. You're going to go directly always to your partner, that they may also struggle from stress, that they may also struggle from these feelings. So you're necessarily dumping those feelings on that partner, expecting them to manage it. B, in problematic relationships, i.e. relationship might be toxic, you're truly reliant on that partner. Notice, the moment that you don't have friends to call you out because you know you have rose-tinted glasses over the relationship, it is way more likely you stick around that relationship. Since you yourself know that the narrative says that I need to spend most time with my partner, therefore in that moment you're way more likely to dig yourself a deeper hole in that relationship. This can have a large impact, from small impacts, i.e. wasting your years in a relationship you don't like, to very bad impacts, i.e. relationship can be extremely problematic, even abusive to an extent, being less likely for you to leave them since you have less friends to call you out on the behavior. You have less people that can monitor the relationship, so you have isolated from the rest. I think this impact is immense. But three, I think you have more hatred towards your partner in open government. This is because you have isolated yourself from your friends, therefore you are way more likely to project your own problems to your partner since they are the only person or the biggest person in your life. Therefore, if your life is going bad, if your job is going bad, you're way more likely to say it's my partner's fault than if you had a more diverse network around you where you would be like, maybe it's everyone, maybe it's myself. The moment you have so much time with one person, it is way more likely that you grow a strain towards the relationship, that you hate them even more. I think this flips government bends because then you have less positive time in your relationship. You feel less romantic. You have less things to be happy in that relationship. Before I move on to the second case, CG.
So you started off your speech with a very reasonable characterization. Let's be real here. People in real life have friends and also have relationships. Why is this mutually exclusive on your side?
Because the narrative is mutually exclusive. You have to spend time with one or the other. So it is these trade-offs you make. Open government themselves said that you might choose the city you live in based on that. You might change your job field in order to be with them. This is big decisions you make, way more likely to make you feel isolated. Secondly, you maximize your own preferences the moment you have more people to network with and more friends. Why are you more likely to find less friends in government? I think two things. One, you go out less, right? Because you're with your partner, you're doing less things with new people. This means directly you meet less people, you have less time to meet new people. But two, I think you preemptively spend time with you preemptively try to not reach out for new friends, since finding new friends has an active cost. You don't know if they're going to be friendly to you, they don't know if they're going to stick around. So since you have your partner, it's a more sure bet to be with your partner than chasing out new friends. All of this means that you probably don't find new people or find less people the moment you don't actively take the risk to chase them. Why this hurts you in the long term? I think this people want to do different things in life, right? I want to do debate, my girlfriend wants to study law. Very different things. This is important because I think, one, The moment you have less people in your life that do your own hobbies or that do similar events with you, you're more likely to force this into your own relationship. I.e., that your own needs and needs be forced on your partner, even if they don't want this necessarily. This is bad because they are not into that in the first place. But B, if you don't force them into this relationship, you directly have the trade-off of you not being able to achieve this. If my partner wants to go out and watch movies and I want to bowl or something, go to bowling, then I'm not gonna go bowling, which is necessarily a trade-off I have to make in my life. In opposition, this is not something that happens. Because the moment you have a variety of friends, you can pick and choose which friends does your hobbies that you like and do everything you want. So for all of the above reasons, vote up in the opposition.
Thanking hello, calling TPM.
POIs however you'd like. Three very simple claims inside DPM. One, why is it easier to maintain friendship than relationships? Second, why is prioritization often a prerequisite towards better quality relationships? And finally, even if I really do have to bite the bullet and the trade-off that we have to prioritize relationship over friendship, relationships are just significantly more important. First claim, it's just significantly easier to maintain a friendship than relationships. This is very clear inside Vedesh's speech, but there are three structural mechanisms that we gave you. Number one, the social expectation of friendships just significantly lower than, for example, relationships. You can have multiple different friends at different phases in life. You, for example, have different friend groups when you're in high school and college. You can always easily reconnect back with your friends, and most clearly just not expected to spend the entire life with your buddy from high school and whatnot. So this means that fundamentally you're just spending less time. It doesn't take as much time or energy in order to foster these type of friendships. But second is just that there's a greater opportunity in order to create friends. Notably, you can have more than one friend at the same time, whereas most of the times it's still frowned upon within society for you to be in polygamous relationships. This then also means that even if some friendships end up falling out because you're unable to put in as much time and energy, even when you're put in different situations, it's still easy to put yourself out there to meet new people, to form new friends, to form new social support networks. These are very prevalent within our current globalized society where social media has also made social interaction quite convenient. But thirdly, it's just that it's incredibly costly to get into relationships, i.e., the social expectations towards relationships often being long-term means that people have to devote a lot of time. You don't expect you'll be friends with someone after a fourth day or a fifth day. You don't worry about becoming exclusive with your friends. You don't worry about stepping into the altar with your friend and whatnot. But all of these things are fundamentally true for relationships, which means that the degree of commitment and time and energy that requires for relationships to work are just naturally higher. This is incredibly important because the implication is that it requires less energy in order to have a good social support circle. This then also means naturally that when we have a balance of priorities in life, it's easier and it's better for us to distribute more time to relationships because it just requires more time and energy for relationships to work, whereas this is not true for friendship. I think CG's POI to OO is completely perfect. These are the mechanisms as to why there just isn't that trade-off in the very first place. And on our side of the house, given the low cost of maintaining friendships, we can still have that. And notably, if we win this, CG just loses the entire case because their argument is literally, you need your friends to tell you why you're doing bad things. It's unclear as to why you need 40 or 50 friends on there, even on our side that we put more time into relationships, as long as you believe that on our side we can still have 4 to 5 good close friends that can call you, that know you well. We already are enough to solve all the harms that they are talking about. Second, I want to talk about prioritization being a prerequisite to relationships. There are 3 things to note down here. The first is prioritization isn't magic. We're not saying that when you prioritize relationships, they will work out, but a deprioritization is often the potion for doom within these relationships. I want to point out even marginal deprioritization is really bad for relationships because either it means A, you're just not putting in that much time and energy, which means that it's really hard for relationships to work out, especially in the long term. Because when you think about spending your entire life with someone, this is often someone who you know well in the very first place. But the second impact is just also when you're deprioritizing relationships, it means you go into worse relationships because you're spending less time and energy. You're not getting to know the person as well as you should. Otherwise, in order to make sure that you're spending the rest of your life with a person that actually truly knows you or appreciates you or understands you. But second thing, I want to talk about is that priority just means you're more likely to be more selective and have a higher bar, and therefore when you enter a relationship, it's often with someone that you actually care for and someone who is good because you know that you're going to spend a lot of time with them, because you know you're going to prioritize your partner on our side of the house, you have a much higher bar. But why is this likely to be true? One, you just learn from your past romantic experiences. If you expect you to prioritize a lot of time and prioritize this person in your life, even if you go through a few rough relationships at the start that are serious but oftentimes harmful, you learn from those experiences so you understand your preferences better and you're more selective in the future. Second, Vedesh paints very well as to why recent narratives around romance often means that people are already quite skeptical within relationships, so they have higher expectations for their partners. But thirdly, it's just that you have people around you in life that will be able to check back against your preferences, right? You talk to your friends and parents about this person that you're seeing. They can give you feedback. They use your knowledge, their knowledge about you in order to help you make better decisions. This is important because this also solves for a lot of ops harms. The biggest issue with OO is that I don't know why a partner can't also do everything they talk about. If anything, real partners can, hold you more accountable and be better because they'll stay with you for a longer time. They know you better. And if on our side we prove that you have a better partner in the first place, not only are we solving for their harms, we're also flipping their argument. But finally, is that I want to point out prioritization often just means that the relationships are going to be stronger. You're spending more time with them. This is important because A, you get to know the person better. Second, you're often more likely to be vulnerable in front of that person, which is important for you to form a strong social network and a strong relationship with your partner. And finally, you can just form much better connections, i.e., you build more memories together, you feel more committed in this relationship, and you're happy in that relationship. Sure, closing, go for it.
If it is so easy to make friends and have 4 to 5 close friends as you characterize, why is there a loneliness epidemic arising from choosing friends over your partner? And why does this epidemic even exist in the first place?
Wait. The epidemic was talking about relationships, not about friends. If anything, we say that the epidemic of relationships means that people are turning to more friends, which again also flips, I think, the point you're about to make. Finally, I'll bite the bullet. Relationships are just significantly more important. We've already proven that friendships are more fluid and flexible, but there are 4 reasons why relationships are much more important. One, the frequency of contact is just significantly larger. You expect to hang out with your partner at least once a week, whereas this is just not true for the case of regular friends, especially if you're like a busy person. Second is the degree of emotional dependence. Even with your close friend, you sometimes still don't feel like you need to tell them about your day. Sometimes you like don't have to talk to them about traumatic experiences, whereas it's quite common within societal expectations to be opening up to your partner in the first place. Thirdly, family building is just massive, especially if you're thinking about conservative cultures. When you pick your partner, this often means that this is someone that you want to build a family with, and independent of how you feel about relationships, family is often a quite deeply ingrained notion of meaning inside society. And finally, since there's this greater societal expectation of you needing to be with partners or being with in relationships, especially in conservative societies where older generations are already pressuring you. This is important because all of these are important sources of meaning for individuals. They want to have a family, they want to have someone they can depend on. But the weighing is also incredibly simple. One, if you just don't have a good relationship, you probably are going to go through mental crises. You're not going to feel good about yourself. That then also trades off with your ability and time and attention to actually make good friends. So our argument prereqs what OO is saying. But second is that the time frame of emotional support is significantly longer. We've proven that you spend more time with your partner throughout your entire life, whereas this is not true for friends. So on our side of the house, you're getting a much more stable and consistent filler of emotional support that can better support your well-being and help you become a better person overall. Incredibly proud, OG.
Thanking DPM, calling the other.
Hi, am I audible?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. If I like drop out or like if I get laggy, just tell me. I'll switch off the camera because I've had a history of that happening sometimes. I think the problem with opening government is that they don't understand this is a narrative motion. Majority of the benefits that they've highlighted for relationships and why you'd want to prioritize your partner are wholly uncomparative because those incentives are just biological, right? Panay has already highlighted the fact that you have a biological incentive to want things like intimacy, want things like spending more time with the person that you love the most. You also have like biological incentives to want to have things like sex. You also want to have a family with this person. You inherently naturally spend more time with your partner because you probably live with them or you probably like share a lot of like shared interests with them. So majority of the explanations opening government gives is just wholly uncomparative and not exclusive to why you need this specific narrative of prioritization. Because inherently in many cases you already spend a large amount of time or large amount of your life with your partner. Where then does the comparative lie? In many cases, this narrative uniquely pushes people into doing things they don't want to do within their relationship, other because narrative itself pushes you. Why is this the case? I think the first reason is the way this narrative in many cases manifests is by saying if you don't prioritize your partner in majority of the cases, you're a bad partner. You aren't as loving as another partner would be. And this is done in things like movies, etc. as well, right? When you have arguments or disagreements with your partner and your friends, you most likely go and pick your partner and you like cut off your friends. In many cases, when you have like preferences that you aren't likely going to be met, or like then you feel like, okay, like I need to like decide on a trip or with my friends, but my partner wants to really like stay at home and like cuddle or something, you prioritize your partner's preferences, right? So in many cases, you have things that you don't want to do. The narrative pushes you to do those things, and I think that's where the majority of the harm lies, because the majority of opening garment is uncomparative. The second reason why this happens in a really problematic way is that you're much less scrutinizing of yourself, because you feel like you're doing the right thing, because majority of the narratives around society are telling you that. So inherently, when you go and prioritize your partner, in majority of the cases, you feel like you're right. You feel like you're a good partner, so you go and do those things without being less like without scrutinizing yourself and the decisions that you make. Why is this problematic, and where does this engage with opening garment? The first thing I want to engage with opening garment is with regards to this argument about the premise they work on, that there's a current trend from society moving away from relationships and the importance of relationships. The first thing they say is that there's a loneliness epidemic with regards to relationships right now, because many people don't have the means to actually go and get relationships. The problem with opening garment here is they never solve the capacity problem, because it's not an incentive problem that exists in status quo. Most people want relationship. You want a family. You want to have sex. You want to be loved by someone. So it is a capacity problem that opening garment never solves. I'm going to explain to you as to why it is much better solved in opening opposition by flipping this. The first reason is when you make more friends, you are much better at social skills and actually making and understanding your preferences and actually talking to different people. And it's a much lower bar, as they themselves said, right? It's easy to make friends. So as a result, when you make more friends and you're more willing to prioritize time to your friends, that is when you're more like able to actually develop the social skills that will allow you to get into friendships and relationships in the first place. But in many cases, making more friends and expanding your friend network is the way you get into relationships, because you most likely get into relationships with your partners, like with your friends, friends like with your mutuals, right? That means that you're like, it's like fucking like things like dating apps don't really work. It's like you need to like actually make meaningful connections through real life. So it's basically expanding the social network that you have that makes you have the capacity to actually go and make friends as well. But the third thing I want to explain here, the third flip is opening government gaslights people. They just say just because you prioritize friends or prioritize wanting a relationship, you get into a relationship. This is just not realistic on how society works, right? You have multiple different barriers that you need to overcome, but they just like don't explain as to how that happens when you have this narrative in the first place. But when you expand your friends, that is when they push back against you as well, right? They push back against your bad behavior even before you get into a relationship. So you reform them, actually become a better person. That is when you become a better candidate to get into a relationship in the first place. So if they want to talk about the loneliness epidemic with regards to relationships, you get much better in our world. Then you just don't try to will yourself into getting a relationship, but actually get friends and change preferences and become a better person. But the second thing they say is that, guys, like there's like a shift in the Eastern world with regards to like arranged marriages, etc. I genuinely don't know why this is the case. This is just completely asserted. In many cases, this motion is quite not relevant to the like majority of the Eastern and southern globe, because in many cases you don't have the ability to get into a relationship in the first place, because there's large amounts of taboo and less likelihood of like having very open and like flexible relationships because of social narratives around arranged marriages being important. So I don't really know where they get the impact from that. Let's first talk about the trade-off of losing friends. And I think the nuance I want to be very clear about is opening government and closing government have to accept somewhat of a trade-off of intensity of friendship. Because opening government just can't say it is very easy to get friends. Potentially. But it's very hard to get friends that you're very close with and you have intense relationships with. And the reason why this is important is those are the friends that you're more likely to open up to. Those are the more friends you're more likely to tell your biggest secrets to. Open up about your emotions and actually talk to them about the deeper secrets that you actually want to care about. This is very important because without that intensity, you never are emotionally vulnerable with your friends. So you pent up majority of your frustrations and your emotional issues amongst yourself, and that is incredibly problematic. And that is when all the harms that Penny is talking about with regards to isolation arises. Before I go on to explain that, I'll take closing argument.
Surely people are not stupid. If they have to cut off some of their friends, they'll be cutting off the less important friends as opposed to the close friends that they already have and retain.
No, of course, this is obviously correct. But the thing is, like, the nuance is that you have to cut off like large amounts of friends as according to opening government's framework, right? Like, because time is an inherent trade-off. So maybe you don't cut off people, but the intensity of time you spend with these people reduces, and that's what I'm going to explain. It becomes really harmful. Without this intensity, you don't open up about your issues. And even when you open up, in many cases, you don't trust these people. You don't trust the word of your friend. You more likely trust and prioritize the word of your partner. This is incredibly isolating, and I'm going to weigh this with regards to why this is debate winning. One, this most likely impacts the most vulnerable people who will have less amount of friends, who are most likely manipulated, have massive power asymmetries with their partner, who can be manipulated and isolated better. This is incredibly harmful for these people. One, because they have very little opt out in this situation. Because when you feel like your only outlet of emotional well-being is your partner, you can never leave your relationship. That is when you need friends, and not just friends, very, very good, strong platonic friends that you have in-depth emotional connections with, because you feel like that is somewhat of a replication. But two, in many cases, if you don't know a person intensely, you will never actually open up, and they never have the capacity to actually change your life in a meaningful way by giving you advice. And the way this should be weighed is this is the most intense thing in this debate, right? It is the most intense when you get manipulated or get isolated, and all the harms manifest in incredibly problematic relationships. Finally, we'll talk about preference maximization. No responses from opening government. Our explanation is very simple. In many cases, we preemptively don't try to make more friends because you feel like that's going to be a time trade-off with your partner. So you don't open up to going out to places. You don't open up to actually hang out with like your friends or your mutuals, etc. And this is incredibly problematic because you are already like you're just comfortable in your own current situation without actually maximizing the benefits or maximizing the preferences and the happiness that you could have otherwise gotten in our world when you have a much better balance with regards to being more flexible with how you prioritize friendships and relationships.
Thanking DLO, calling MC.
Hello, am I visible, audible?
Yep.
Okay, give me a moment to set my timer, then I'll start my speech. The characterization in this debate has been reasonably messy. This house supports motion. The characterization, therefore, is pretty clear, right? There is an existing narrative in status quo that we should prioritize our partners over our friends, and then the question is just whether or not this is a good or bad thing. Crucially, therefore, I think a lot of the OG and OO claims start to fall into the background, right? Because I think that they've both adopted a reasonably uncharitable view of the motion. OG basically tells you that you're going to neglect your partner. I don't think this is the case in status quo. OO tells you that you're going to be socially isolated and have no friends. Once again, I also don't think this is the case in status quo. We want to be very charitable here. CG's position is this, right? Probably you're going to spend 75% of your time with your partner and 25% of your time with your friends. There are two burdens here. Number one, we can prove why this is sufficient, and therefore you can still maintain both your friendships. But number two, we want to prove to you why the trade-off is therefore worth it, right? So we're just going to try and win on both. I think it's probably true that it's sufficient, but even if it's untrue, I think the trade-off is just very much worth it. First extension, therefore, on the time sync with your partner. Very simply, I think that this debate has operated on a very odd misconception of how like you pick your partner, right? Presumably, you don't spend time with people that make you miserable or don't make you very happy, right? So like this narrative doesn't change that. Presumably, there are still narratives around the world about how the ideal partner is like, what makes you truly happy, and therefore people only opt into long-term relationships with people at the point at which they think that those people are the right ones for them. And I think even O agrees with this when you talk about how the partner is the person that you feel the happiest with, and that's why you have a biological and emotional imperative to stay with them, right? Crucially, therefore, these are the people that make you the most happy, and crucially, a special kind of happy, a romantic happiness that doesn't exist anywhere else. But secondly, they also are able to provide things like sexual satisfaction that make you incredibly happy, right? So it is probably true that you want to spend time with them. And therefore, if you have a narrative that allows you to spend more time with them, you are able to maximize your happiness. Sachin then asks what the comparative is, right? Because the argument here is that, if you are already going to do this, we don't need that narrative. But the issue here is that narratives work both ways. And this is the classic thing in narrative debates, right? On one hand, you have the internal narrative. Let's say that the narrative that shapes your belief of your duties. But crucially, you also have an external narrative, which is the way in which people treat you as a result of your actions based on the narratives that they believe to be the right thing in society, right? Crucially, therefore, we'd argue to you that as in this narrative, you're going to have to spend far more time justifying why you spend time with your partner in status quo to your friends because they are less understanding of the fact that you enjoy spending time with your partner, you love them very much, and therefore want to prioritize them over them, right? So crucially, therefore, it is not about what your internal preferences are. We think they naturally lean towards your partner. It's about the ability of society to lean towards you and therefore accommodate your preferences. But secondly and crucially, the reason why it's particularly important is because we don't think your substantive duties to your partner change in either world. That's to say that your partner will still expect the same level of care and attention because of the narratives that exist in society. The issue, therefore, is that we don't think you're able to deliver that same level of care and attention if insofar as this narrative doesn't exist, because you find yourself being tied to your friends and being forced to, I don't know, accommodate their preferences and make them feel happy so they don't feel like you're breaching your duties to them, right? So they expect you to spend more time with them. You're therefore less able to spend time with your partner. But crucially, this isn't just a question about a time sink, it is also about priorities. Let us say that it is not necessarily true that in our way to justify one in which you spend all your time with your partner. Because crucially, priority is just about who you spend time on first. That is to say that when you receive a call from your best friend who is crying and your wife who is crying, you probably spend more time on your wife first. That doesn't mean you can't go to your best friend later on after you've dealt with your wife and explain and talk through their problems, right? So therefore, the crucial thing to note here is that it is not necessarily true that our narrative leads to social isolation, because the question of priority doesn't refer to the absolute amount of time, but also your ability to spend time on the important people in your life first. This becomes particularly important once you have things like kids, right? Because presumably the happiness of your kids and their lives are dependent upon the stability of your own family. Therefore, when you prioritize your partner, your wife, for instance, and the relationship is less dysfunctional, it not only protects your wife's emotions and yours as well, but also your family and the wider people and the network around you that matters the most, i.e. your kids, etc. Right. Now, let's talk about the trade-off here, right? Because let's say we accept that there has to be a time trade-off, that it is necessarily true that you're going to end up with end up losing some friends. Ultimately, we argue that this is fine for a couple of reasons. The first thing to note here is that we think that time is ultimately finite once you become an adult, right? It's very nice for us university students to contemplate us being able to maintain 3 to 5 platonic friends that are really close to us, etc. But the issue here is that once we start working, once we all become like these lawyers with dead-end jobs or whatever job that takes up most of your time, I'll take a POI later on, right? We think that at the end of the day, you just can't manage these number of people. And most of the time, people do default to one single person because they recognize that this is the person that is probably the most stable within their lives and they're able to constantly refer to every time they come back from a shit job, because that person is willing to make the sacrifice to spend time with them and talk to them, etc. So we don't think it's true that you're able to maintain 3 to 5 platonic friends once you start the working world, once you start working 9 to 9s. And therefore, we think it's good that from the very get-go, you are prioritizing a single person, because very often when you do grow up, you are only able to prioritize your family and your wife and your children. And therefore, that means that spending time with them is a good thing, because necessarily so you just don't have the time for other people. Finally, let's talk about the comparative as to platonic friends. Before I move on, I'll take a POI from closing. Sorry, from opening.
Yeah, so the unique mechanism that you have is that you can explain to your friends why you want to hang out with your partner. But this is uncomparative because surely your friends also have partners. So they know why you would want to prioritize time. So that isn't a unique reason either.
Well, no, right? Because presumably this narrative is about the approval of your friends in relation to your partner. People can be very hypocritical all the time, right? People are deeply selfish, but yet expect other people to help them. So I think it's probably true that your friends will have more unreasonable expectations. And that's why this narrative exists, right? It's a chicken and egg thing. Like, the reason why this narrative exists is because people have their own relationships and because they then recognize that this is true. But in this world where you have this narrative suddenly disappear, presumably that's the comparative, then it is probably true that people are going to be more unreasonable with their expectations to you, even though they personally recognize that they like their partners. I don't think this is an argument. Moving on, therefore, on the comparative of friends, right? So we want to argue to you that the first thing to note here is that we think that you are still able to make friends. We think that it's sufficient. And there are a couple of reasons for this. Number one, because your partner can't be with you all the time. And in that social space, when your partner isn't there because they are working or have other commitments in their life, you can then spend time with your friends, right? And note the charitable comparative here, you still can spend 25% of your time with your friends. But the second thing is you often have periods of singlehood. Like, most of the time, you start off not dating people. Like, you have perhaps 14 years of your life where you aren't in a relationship, and therefore you're able to form those close friendships. We argue that most of your close friendships form in childhood anyway. The third point, however, is that out of proximity and necessity, you do end up making friends. When you're at the workplace, for instance, your partner isn't there, and you have to find allies in the office, right? And that's when you therefore make friends with the people around you and go out for after-party socials with them. We think, therefore, that friends are still available in either world, right? But more importantly, crucially, we don't think you have a wide network of platonic friends in either world, right? In either world, you'll probably only focus your time on 3 to 5 really close friends, right? And the issue here, however, is that we think that those friends don't have a duty to stay with you, right? Because these friends aren't your romantic partner. And therefore, it means that their friendship is incredibly unstable, right? They can leave because they have a new job, because they found a new partner, because they want to move to a new city. And therefore, it is not worth investing your time in them, because these people don't stay with you and continuously deliver you happiness, while your partner has to, because they owe you specific romantic duties within your relationship. We therefore think that makes that time thing far more worth it and more enduring. Go with side CG.
Thanking member girl, calling member O.
Hi, can everybody hear me if I speak like this? Sorry, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, cool. Second. Take you guys in chat, please. Two extensions from closing opposition. First, why this narrative disproportionately affects women and enables their abuse. Secondly, why a world in which we value platonic friendships more is a world in which we make better decisions about our romantic relationships when we feel less insecure, and why we have better friendships going beyond the opening opposition assertion that time equals intensity. First, on women. Why does this narrative disproportionately affect women more than it affects men? There are three reasons for this. First, men are less sensitive to social norms because they feel more entitled to relationships. Male entitlement is just a fact of patriarchal societies that we all live in. When men are told that they deserve the affection of women, that they're told that they deserve happy relationships, even if they're not willing to put effort into this. Think about how easy it is, for example, for men in conservative societies and even in non-conservative societies to more easily win the affection of their parents and social validation just for being men. Comparatively, it is far more difficult to do this when you're a woman. Second, women significantly have also been told that they owe more in relationships compared to men, and have told that relationships are a more significant part of their life. So this has been socially signaled to women as more significant, which is why they put in more effort and why this narrative drives them to do even more. You're told that you need to take care of your husband versus men who are told that the way that they contribute to a relationship is focusing on their career. Women disproportionately face the glorification of romantic relationships. Think about like children's media as early as Disney princesses that tell women that the most meaningful thing in their lives is a romantic relationship. Third, there are lots of toxic norms within male friend groups uniquely, like misogynistic tropes about not spending too much time with a woman and not becoming too dependent on her, and how you can never trust them, but you can trust your bros because they're your bros. That exist uniquely in male friend groups that I just don't think exist in female friend groups in the same degree, but they're probably more supportive of romantic relationships because they recognize that it's important for your happiness. So that is a unique reason why men also disproportionately feel less of a pressure to spend time with women, even if they are their romantic partners, even if this narrative exists. Now, why is this bad? First, we actually unlock OO's harms of dependency. Because the problem, as GovBench points out, is that you probably still have some friends on both sides of the house. And we accept that this is probably true, even if you are a woman, amidst all of this social pressure and amidst the additional social pressure, which is unlocked by this narrative, which strengthens all three things I previously talked about. But what does happen is that you feel that you have fewer friends than your male partner. And this is when you get the harms of jealousy that opening opposition talks about. When you feel like your partner is responsible for inhibiting your social life. Maybe this is something you're willing to do in the short term, that is cut off your friends and spend less time with them because of the social pressure, because you're not in a relationship already, therefore you value it more. But eventually, as time goes on, that is when you start to become bitter, when you start to become resentful, when you blame your partner for not having friends in the first place, not even just being able to not spend time with them. So we get those harms of feeling worse about yourself, of blaming your partner. But second, we also create a unique environment in which gaslighting and abuse can happen. And we accept probably like the worst cases of abuse happen regardless of this narrative. But over time, We think social isolation, when you spend more time with your partner and less time with your friends, is when you lose your grip on what realistic standards in a relationship are like. You spend less time viewing and talking to others about your own relationship. So you don't have that external source of validation. You don't see other people's relationships. So you have less of a benchmark to judge this on. Maybe you rely on things like your parents' relationship, which in many cases could probably be quite toxic and abusive, given that it existed in a prior age when these kinds of things were more acceptable. For example, gaslighting your partner. So it's over time becoming accustomed to this kind of gaslighting and abuse that allows your partner to get away with it. This becomes far easier on their side of the house. Uniquely, we think that this hurts women. Now, what is the comparative? We get one line from opening government that your friends can call you out, but we will mechanize this. We think that it's probably true, given all of our analysis, and we accept this, that women probably still feel a lot of social pressure to like spend time with their male partner, right? This narrative is not unique. There are other narratives. But what does happen in the absence of this narrative is that you also feel an equal pressure to spend time with your friends. You feel you have an obligation to them because they are your childhood friends, because they depend on you for their happiness, because you owe them something because of everything that they have sacrificed for you. We live in a society in which accepting your friends, friendships and platonic friendships as being just as important as romantic relationships matters. So the likely compromise that people come to is that you integrate your romantic partner into your friend group in a way that is very productive. Why do we think that this is good? First, we think that it just allows people to get a vibe check on what their relationship is like. And this is very good when you're in the honeymoon stage, when you have blinders to your partner's red flags, when your friends who you know and trust, who have your best interest at heart because you know you've spent quite a significant amount of time with them, can call you out. And you can get multiple different viewpoints because as everybody agrees, you have multiple friends. That is when you can make a better assessment about whether this person is a good romantic partner, or maybe you're just blinded in the throes of love and the honeymoon phase. Secondly, we just think that even for the male partner, seeing what your friends are like is a good signal of the kind of person that you are, right? Like if these are the kind of people that you associate with, if these are the kind of people that you enjoy spending time with, it's just a better way for people to come to the conclusion of whether this is also somebody individually that I want to spend time with. Thirdly, we also think that seeing how somebody interacts in social settings when they're not just alone with you can be an early indicator of whether they are a bad person. For example, if they treat your friends poorly, that's a good reflection of the fact that they will probably eventually treat you poorly when they come out of the honeymoon stage and when they are no longer enthralled with you. All of this proves that you actually do get the kind of advice that opening opposition wanted to talk about, but you get it in a comprehensive way from multiple different viewpoints from people that you can trust, which is why people make better decisions about relationships on our side. If I'm one, I'll take opening.
Yeah, the societies with conservative relationship norms are also the ones that will pressure women to enter into relationships regardless, which is why this narrative actually solves the problem
Guys,
by compelling more people to care.
yeah, I know. Let's be reasonable here, right? Like even Western societies have dominant conservative norms of the kind that we've talked about, right? We are not saying that in the most conservative societies this argument applies, but clearly there is a middle ground where it does. Second, why does valuing platonic friendships more mean that you make better relationship decisions? On their side of the house, you know that eventually your platonic friends, their end goal is getting into a romantic relationship. This is very bad because first, when you fear losing your platonic friends, without this narrative that tells you that you should spend equal amounts of time with your friends and your romantic partner generally, you assume that your platonic friends will act according to this narrative and prioritize their own romantic relationships. This applies in the best case of GovBench. Even if you currently have friends, you fear that in the future you won't, because eventually these people will get into romantic relationships and will leave you behind if you do not also find a romantic partner that you can individually spend time with that can prioritize you. Second, you face a lot of humiliation about being the only friend in the friend group who is not in a relationship, because relationships are a signal of social status, about how desirable you are, about the kind of person that you want to be. And because we're social creatures, we don't want to feel this insecurity among our friends. Third, you don't want to feel like a burden to your friends. You don't want to feel like the third wheel in everybody's friend group hangout when everybody's with their significant others. The harm of this is that you prematurely rush into relationships just to be in a relationship, to not burden your friends, to feel that same sense of social validation that they feel. On our side of the house, when you value these relationships equally, you don't feel that pressure.
Thanking member of calling Kavip.
Hi, can I check that I'm audible and visible?
Yep.
All right, thank you. All right, I'll start my speech on the next word. I'm going to do a few things in my speech today. First, I'm going to deal with some of the extraneous material coming from closing opposition. Then I'm going to claim that underpins both opening opposition and closing opposition, which is basically that somehow when you prioritize your romantic partner, you neglect all your friends and now you have no more friends, and therefore you lead a very isolated life. Then the third thing I'm going to do is just a bit of weighing and impacting as to why these romantic relationships, even if we accept the trade-off in the most charitable scenarios, are the most important thing and are the thing that should be debate winning for closing government. The first thing I want to do, therefore, is just deal with closing opposition's new arguments. The first thing he tells you is that there's a lot of gaslighting, abuse, and misogyny. Importantly, I think this doesn't engage with Joshua's extension, which is in itself debate winning, because he explains to you very logically and very clearly why the expectations change on our side, the narrative changes the expectations, because this is ultimately a narrative motion. However, what doesn't change are the internal expectations from your partner, for instance. This is really important because it's important to understand the nuance, right? That on our side, other people are more understanding when you choose to prioritize your partner. Whereas on their side, even if we do away with the narrative, your partner is always going to expect you to spend the most time with them for all the reasons that they have already given, right? Things like biological incentives, the fact that people are just generally selfish, that they like to be prioritized, the fact that if you get into this kind of relationship, you are expected to spend most of your time with your partner. Importantly, then, what this means is that even if we do not have this narrative anymore, you will still be expected to spend most of the time with your partner by your partner. The only thing that changes is how you are able to justify that and whether or not you feel and see yourself in a bind. On their side, it gets far worse for these people because while your expectations of your partner in this very misogynistic society do not change, what changes is you find it a lot harder to justify to your friends why you are prioritizing your partner over them and why you're spending more time with your partner. This further isolates the people on their side, and this is a complete flip of their substantive because at the point at which now these friends expect you to be spending more of your time with them and you do not, that is when you become even more isolated. But the second flip to this is that it's just generally probably better for these people who are less powerful in these relationships because now what it does is it forces the partners and the romantic partners to spend more time with them in the first place, which is probably good for them because they feel less isolated and less neglected. This is something that only happens on our side when these people are expected to prioritize their relationships and are not like expected to just go out and have like a lot of other relationships elsewhere. The second claim CEO makes is that you somehow rush into relationships. I think this is just completely uncharitable and also uncomparative. Like, firstly, it's probably true that there are generally societal expectations that you get into a relationship in the first place. Again, for all the characterization that has more or less been agreed, the fact that like you expect something more out of a non-platonic relationship or a romantic relationship, and then you just generally crave things like intimacy and like sex, for instance. This probably means that you already want to get into some sort of relationship. But second, you also probably have like lots of other friends or like single friends. So this isn't something that is probably going to be unique on our side. And third, I think when you, for instance, start working, there are just going to be so many more important extraneous pressures. I don't think CEO can get away by like saying that somehow you're just going to be forced into a relationship on our side of the house. The second thing, therefore, I want to do is just make a couple of rebuttals to the main OO and CEO claim that basically you become incredibly isolated because you have no friends. The first thing to note here is that I think Josh already gives you lots of reasons as to why friendships are a lot more low maintenance because you can operate off things like hobbies and shared interests. OO tells you that you're less likely to seek out these kinds of relationships when you're just staying with your partner. But I think the important thing to note here is that even if you spend more time with your romantic partner, this doesn't change the interests and hobbies that you have. So, for instance, if you like debating and your partner doesn't like debating, you're probably still going to be making a lot of friends through debate because these are things that don't change. Importantly, these are also things that are a lot less low, like a lot more low maintenance, simply because people expect a lot less and like friendships can be maintained a lot less. Just intuition pump. Look at how you're probably able to maintain many of your friendships through like chatting to them occasionally. They might not even live in the same city. Whereas if you think about doing a long distance relationship, that's probably something that is going to be extremely onerous and a bad decision. The second response to this is just, again, the analysis and extension coming from Josh that was basically untouched by both like opening opposition and closing opposition, that you just change the narrative that is that you are able to push to your friends, and therefore the friends expect less of you. The importance and cruciality of this is that at the point at which your friends expect less from you, that is also when you can continue to maintain the existing relationships that you have with them, and therefore get all the benefits that CEO and OO want to talk about. Whereas like at the same time, you're able to better maintain the romantic relationship with your partner, because this is naturally something that you're able to do when you invest more time and energy into the relationship. The third and very important thing to note is that you're just generally a social creature, so you probably are able to make friends everywhere, like at your workplace, when you go for your hobbies, when you like go out, for instance. I don't think it's necessarily mutually exclusive. And the fourth thing to note is that, like, when they say you make better decisions when you spend time with more friends, I think the flip of this is that you're probably able to make better decisions in relation to your relationship at the point at which you spend more time with your partner, because that allows you to understand your partner better, and it allows you to invest more time and allows you to be more connected to the relationship. Before I move on, I'll take opening opposition.
Isolating yourself within the relationship is an impact that applies to all genders. CO is derivative on both cases, while CG does not explain why the narrative adds on anything that doesn't happen in the status quo because of social or biological needs. Clear OO.
We clearly explain why we add something different, because we explain that the expectations from your partner do not change, and so they continue to expect you to invest a lot of energy and time into the relationship. At the point at which now you are forced to choose between, like, the choice is made a lot more stark. In fact, on opposition, as per Josh's analysis, because now you're forced to choose between your friends and your partner, because your partner still expects you to spend time with them, whereas your friends also now expect you to spend time with them. The impact of Josh's extension, which again, no response from closing opposition, is basically that it is logically prior to everything, right? We show and we flip the entire opposition case by explaining why on our side you get friends as well. But the important thing is you are better able to maintain these friendships because your friends don't expect you to be spending all the time with them, and that you can in fact spend more time with your romantic partners, for instance. Josh impacts this by explaining to you why the time that you have is finite, and you necessarily need to spend a huge deal of time on your family and your relation and your romantic relationship and your children, for instance, for this to be meaningful. This is better than OG because it gives you actual analysis as to why this narrative makes romantic relationships better, because you actually spend more time with them, but it also flips the entire opposition case. And for all these reasons, go with closing government.
Thanking GovWeb, calling off web.
Hello, am I clearly audible and visible?
Yep.
Okay, great. I'll just start on my next word. I'll take POS verbally, please. Cool. So if closing government had actually listened to Chanudu's speech, they would know that the two extensions that he gives actually do enough to take down their case. But even if not, I'm just going to spend the next 7 minutes whipping that extension and proving why it beats all teams in the room, starting with some rebuilding, then moving to CG, then OG, and then doing some bench weighing against O. Firstly, then, rebuilding to the responses we get from Government Whip. Broadly, Government Whip gives us two kinds of responses. First, in response to our first extension, they say, but the internal expectations in the relationship don't change. So your shitty boyfriend still expects you to spend a disproportionate amount of time with him. The only difference is the extent to which you can justify this to your partner. And they call this a flip, but I think this is the greatest non-flip of all time that I've ever seen in a debate, because that is the point we're making. It is harder for you to justify your boyfriend's shitty behavior to your platonic friends, and because your platonic friends presumably care about you because they are nice people, they will then say, look, babe, that's not all right. We think you're spending too much time with this shitty guy, and if this guy is making you cut off all your platonic friends, this is potentially toxic. This does not happen on their side of the house because of the narrative that it is okay to prioritize your partner significantly over your platonic friends. Therefore, the first benefit that Chanadu gives you in his first extension, which is on their side, there is a massive harm of women being locked into bad relationships and being far more prone to things like gaslighting and other forms of abuse, still stands, and we uniquely solve for this. And therefore, the second response that GovWhip makes to this extension, which is spending more time with your partner is good, doesn't really happen because we proved to you why in many cases that is actually a bad thing. So it is easier for you to like not fall into these traps on our side of the house. The second response, which government whip makes to our second extension, is the rushing into relationships happens anyways because there are many pressures to get into relationships anyways, ignoring the fact that like the entirety of closing government cases, like one of the biggest it happens anyways I've ever seen in a debate. No, this doesn't happen anyways. Why is this true? So the incentives to get into relationships perhaps are somewhat similar on both sides of the house, but there's familiar pressures, societal pressures, whatever. What is unique, however, is the capacity or how you feel about other relationships, platonic and romantic. What do I mean by this? On our side of the house, you have other single friends, and there is a tacit understanding that it is okay to be single for a while, even if you want to get into a relationship eventually. On their side of the house, the moment one of your platonic friends gets into a relationship, they automatically deprioritize that platonic friendship. So as time passes, you have less and less platonic friends, and particularly less and less close platonic friends, which creates a natural impetus to rush faster into relationships on their side of the house because you want to substitute the lost platonic intimacy with romantic intimacy, which is why you rush more on their side, and therefore you are likely to make worse decisions when choosing partners. So the second impact also stands in this debate. Now, I think both of those
Point.
impacts win. I will explain why they win as well, along with some extraneous responses. Let us deal with closing government first. Closing government has this whole idea of like, given that the trade-off happens anyways, this is about how easy it is for you to justify it to your friends. Ignoring the fact that this is somewhat marginal, like if the trade-off happens anyways and you end up not talking to your friends, unclear why you then need to justify it. But regardless, let's respond. Two things to say here. First, I just want to note that O already preempts this, right? So O says it might be fine if like you have some friends, but you do need close friends because of the fact that, oftentimes it is useful for you to be able to be emotionally vulnerable with your friends. And therefore, like this is good, right? Clearly, and I think this is particularly important given closing government's characterization themselves where they say that because of pressures like a job and so on and so forth, you might initially have close friends and who might be low maintenance, but over time these platonic friendships become increasingly higher maintenance because you have less time to spend with them. And the reason why this is very bad is because I actually don't agree with government characterization where they assume that like all relationships end in marriage and happily ever after, right? So like statistically, the average person goes through about 4 long-term intimate romantic relations in their lives. And the reason for this is very simple. Like oftentimes when you first start dating, when you're fresh out of high school or in college, you're often not very mature as a person. Oftentimes the work pressures that separate you from your platonic friends can also create tensions in a relationship where two people have like different career priorities. So what this means is in cases where relationships go bad, it is very important for you to have access to close platonic friends so that like there's at least one or two like close like brothers or sisters that you have who you can cry to or be emotionally vulnerable to. And this is critically lost on their side of the house. But we go one step further in opening opposition. We prove to you why, given the case that in the status quo there are many cases where people, particularly women, get into bad relationships, why we're able to uniquely solve for this. Because the unique mechanism which Chandu gives you, which government whip never responds to, by the way, check your notes panel, is just at the point where social pressures to spend time with your partner exist on our side of the house as well, but you also have a social pressure to spend time with your friends. The likely compromise solution that people come to is to just take their partner with them to hang out with their friend groups. So it's like a percolation of different romantic partners into
Point.
friend groups, which is very good because your friends can vibe check your partner. Your partner can spend time with your friends. You better understand each other as people, and therefore we solve a lot of the problems of like miscommunication and jealousy and a lack of trust that currently exists in relationships. So this beats CG. Let's deal with OG. And I'm going to be fairly quick here because I do think, OG runs a pretty weird case and it's already thoroughly responded to. But just broadly, right? Like, one, there's a massive problem solution mismatch insofar as the narrative of like prioritizing your partner has already existed for a long time. It clearly failed to prevent the rise of the loneliness epidemic. And therefore, the loneliness epidemic was probably caused by other things like, women having standards and not being willing to put up with really misogynistic men. So that probably still exists and is outside of the remit of this debate. But second, there's this
Point.
weird tension within opening government case where they say that, you will hold the relationship to higher standards. What does that higher standard mean? Surely if you can't threaten to leave your partner if they're a dick to you, it is harder for you to enforce those higher standards, right? So their case is like lacking a clear impact over there. I think that puts them out. Anyways, I'll take opening before I move on.
Yeah, so we give three reasons as to why friendships are more low maintenance and therefore you can have them on both sides of the house. Please engage.
So we accept that casual friendships are indeed low maintenance. The problem is they don't matter if you can't actually be emotionally vulnerable to them. And building those emotional bonds requires a greater amount of maintenance, which neither government team engages with. There is nuance to the kinds of friendships. Okay, finally, let's weigh over our opening opposition. I think there are three things to say here. First, our first extension is not derivative, as opposed, in contrast to what CO asserts in contrast to what O asserts in their POI, simply because our unique impact is women having fewer friends than men, right? So even if both have some number of friends, there's a degree of inequality created because of other social narratives, which unlocks a lot of significant extent of impact on blame, jealousy, women ending up in worse relationships, etc. The second piece of weighing to do here is, I think, O depends on people not having friends at all or having very less friends, which as CGPOIs is unlikely. We only rely on the future expectation that eventually you will lose your friends. Therefore, even if you have them now, therefore you will rush into relationships to preempt this. And this is bad, right? Third, we mechanize how, given that people will still probably prioritize their relationships, spending time with friends happens on our side of the house. And this integration of friend groups is a unique impact that we give you, which is better than saying your partner will ignore your interests, but your friends will have them. You probably share your interests with your partner and your friends. For all of these reasons, vote CO.
Thanking opposition for that speech. With that, we come to the end of what was a very engaging